this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. A couple of mounts this time out of the big box. Gradually working my way through them, but it will take time. And as I said when I first sort of got the plants out of the box and then had a look at them the next day, some of them can stay in the pot they're in for some time. They're not in any hurry, but some are. Now this is an interesting one, very interesting in fact. It's Dendrobium cunico, and I've looked it up. It's a primary cross, and it's a primary cross between one orchid I've never heard of, Dendrobium goldschmidtianum, German Schmidt spelling, I'll put a pop up, and it's been crossed with Dendrobium Victoria Regeniae, and that's going to be interesting, providing it pulls on. It's got some cold damage. There's definitely some leaves that have been damaged, but nonetheless it has some new growths that look like they might have got away with it. I'm not sure. Now that's a conflict, because although they come from similar areas, not exactly the same, the two parents of this are sort of opposite ends of the scale. Victoria Regeniae is a cool grower. That can grow up to 2,500 metres and possibly even a bit higher. So it's capable of being grown quite cool. Whereas the other one is more of a warm grower. So with any luck the two balance out and it'll be happy in the grow room with the sort of intermediate temperatures. But as I was looking up the Victoria Regeniae, something sprung to mind that may not have ever come up before. That grows in forests along with azaleas and rhododendrons. Well, they're acid lovers, but then the dendrobium itself doesn't grow down in the ground, it grows in the trees. So the fact that the trees are growing in a more acid environment, because azaleas and rhododendrons do not like, you know, alkaline soil, they like acidic soil. So yeah, an odd one, but it's quite a cool grower. But the other one's a warm grower, and the combination of the blooms, I'll be very interested in, very interested. The goldschmidtianum is a bright, intense cerise pink, and it blooms in quite tight clusters. Victoria Regeniae, as we all know, is well, a lot of people say it's blue, but it's a deep purple, but it's a gorgeous colour. The combination of the two could be very, very interesting indeed. As if we ever get it to bloom, first job is to get it to live. As I say, there is some cold damage on here. It's not dramatic, but there is some. Now, half the plant doesn't mind the cold, and the other half doesn't like it. Well, argue it out amongst yourselves. My main interest is it's in very, very soggy moss, and it's a solid compacted mass, so that's going to have to be teased out under the tap carefully. There are some viable roots, so I'm not too worried about the root system, but I am going to mount it on the grounds it does lend itself to hanging quite nicely. And it shouldn't get too big. I mean, I've got Victoria Regeniae about to bloom. Woohoo! But anyway, I'll clean that one off under the tap. Now the other one is a very interesting species, which, if I can say it, is Linguella. And the cane on this is over 2 foot long. The leaves are badly damaged by the cold. They've definitely suffered, but given the length of that cane, obviously the leaves were right butted up against the cardboard on the outside of the box, so it obviously got cold. It also fell out of the pot. I had to jam it back in as a temporary measure by sticking a skewer through the pot. It has got some roots. I've seen them because it fell out of the pot, but nonetheless this is not what it seems. I'll give that a rinse off. I think these roots are still viable. It's a very fine root system, and these aren't all brown and falling apart. So I think they're viable, but if you look at the length of that cane, there's no way that's been grown like that. That's been broken off of a very mature plant where the canes are growing to their full size, which doesn't happen on a young plant. Yeah? So this came off a very large plant, and quite honestly that piece is a bit small to have taken off on its own. So I'm totally reliant on this thing actually starting some new growths, and I suspect if it does live and does push out some new growths, they'll probably be quite short to start with while it gets itself established. But I don't need to trim those roots, I just need to get them set up on a mount and hope that it produces some new growths and that the cold damage didn't eat right into the plant, if you see what I mean. Because you can get cell damage right into canes and pseudobulbs, and that box was subjected to sub-zero temperatures for a fair bit of its journey, I suspect. So, but it's worth mounting it to see if it will grow. Those leaves are not going to stay on there long. They're just going to fall off, and then it will be a leafless cane. But a lot of deciduous dendrobiums end up with leafless canes, so it's not the end of the world. So I'll have not a massive clear up because I haven't made too much of a mess, but I'll just tidy myself up, get the mounts out, and then we'll get those set up on a couple of mounts. Okay, we'll get the easy one done first. So I always use fishing line. I like it because it's virtually invisible. I know some don't like it, but I do. I'm quite happy. It's a small piece of bark, so I don't need a mountain of fishing line, so I won't need to go around very many times. This is not a heavy plant. It's a very lightweight plant. And whoever it is, several people in fact, that tell me off every time I put my plant on the bark and then try and tie it, they always tell me off and say, why don't you put your tie on the bark first and then it will stay there? Well, it's usually because I forget. Well, I remembered this time, so no telling off for Roger this time. But it does make sense to actually secure your first turn on the bark, and then you haven't got to worry about holding anything. It's just there, ready to go, providing you put it in the right place in the first place. Now, all I'm going to do with these roots is I'd like to get some of them pointing downwards without bent. In fact, I think most of them can point downwards, and the plant can be nearer the top of the mount, or it will be once I stand it upright. And my methodology for mounting nowadays is based on putting the roots against the bark and then putting however much moss I choose to put on it, which sometimes is a lot and sometimes is very little. And in this case, all I really need to do with this plant for a while is keep it lightly hydrated. This doesn't need to stay soaking wet. It needs to just stay hydrated enough to hopefully produce some new shoots. And I will leave some of the roots bare so that they can get air around them, and some moss on some of the roots. So there's some that will effectively be aerial automatically, and they'll get hydrated when I water it, but some of them will stay hydrated as long as the moss stays moist, which again will be every time I water it. Long term, this cane is highly unlikely to stay on the plant. I suspect that cane is as big as they grow, and as a consequence of growing where I would suggest this was originally grown in its country of origin or nearby, and this was once a big specimen plant that's just been torn into many pieces to make as much money as possible, because that's what, if you're in business, that's what you need to do. But as a consequence, with the much shorter day lengths in the UK, therefore the shorter growing season, I doubt if I'll ever grow a cane that long again. So once I've got 4 or 5 new growths on the go, that cane can probably come off, because it's going to lose its leaves, but I'll leave it long enough to see if it's going to bloom. Not that daft. Right, now all I need to do here is I'm going to put one turn between the pseudobulbs to hold the base of the plant firm, not garrot the cane, and then just put another couple round just to secure the moss. You notice I'm not winding this tight, and also remember, Roger, to go under the cane, not over the top. It's the roots we're tying on, not the cane. I'm a little bit clumsier than normal today. This is the end of an incredibly long day for me, having been woken up, I was going to say at the crack of dawn, but well before dawn. As I say, this is the end of an incredibly long day, so I'm quite cream crackered at the moment. The first sign of being tired when you're playing with your orchids is getting clumsy, dropping things, knocking plants over, you know, tying your fingers on your mount and then finding that your fingers are well attached to the mount and the plant falls off. I've never done that, of course. Honest. But yeah, it does pay to be in the mood when you're playing with your orchids, and enjoy it, if you know what I mean. If it's a chore, then perhaps it might be better left till the next day. I haven't got a tag for this right now. I will put one on there obviously, but I need to go and write one out. So I'll do a new tag for this, my shiny white ones. So that's that one. The plant base is secured, and there's a couple of ties around the roots. Some of the roots are aerial, but there's plenty under the moss to be hydrated. And if I wind that slowly up past the camera, you'll see just how long that cane is. It's ridiculous. But mounted, what amount of space does that take up? It's vertical space. You know, that piece of bark is tiny and it can hang down with other plants. So that takes up next to no space at all, which is what I like about mounted orchids. They're vertical space, they don't take up horizontal space on shelves, which I haven't got much of. Right, I'll be back to do the other one when I've cleaned up the roots. Okay, this one has got a, quite honestly, that's a pretty good root system. I've trimmed a few off, but I don't want to go too mad because it's a branching type root system, so even a few roots that might have some dead ends are still capable of branching out and producing new roots. I just didn't want to take too many off. Cold damage on here is not as obvious and is not everywhere, but the plant was hydrated despite it being in quite compacted and reasonably old moss. Nonetheless, it was hydrated, so when you see leaves going limp like this, they have suffered some cold damage, but there's also some that don't look too bad. At the end of the day, it's a deciduous dendrobium, so eventually it's going to drop all these leaves anyway, and hopefully replace them with a lot of new growths. That's my theory. You listening? Now both of the mounts I've just used are, their previous occupants have ceased to be. The previous one I did was a Tulumnia. That was one of the ones that just got eaten by the scale and keeled over. So, you know, it's a reuse. And in fact, this one had a larger Tulumnia on it as well that didn't make it. So they've both been used before. To sterilise mounts, all I do is pour boiling water all over them and leave them to soak. And then after about 10 minutes I do it again just to make absolutely sure. There's not much lives underneath boiling water, quite honestly. The plant itself this time did get a spray with the hydrogen peroxide, and a lot of that because there was signs of algae and actual living moss that's not sphagnum moss at the base of that plant, probably from where it originated, but hopefully that will have killed that off. It's not essential to do that, but it got done anyway in case there was anything living in there as well. When you get a tight root mass like that, it's very easy to get an odd snail tucked in there that you miss by eye, but if it gets a good soak with the H2O2, that should deal with the little blighters. I've actually mounted stuff when I never used to use the hydrogen peroxide, and then you just notice some of the new root tips just go missing, and you sort of think, what's going wrong with the plant? And what's going wrong with the plant is a couple of snails are in under the plant, and they live in the cracks in the bark, and then they come out at night and chew off the root tips when you're not looking. And they're not always obvious, because they're mainly those tiny little bush snails are their nickname. What their proper scientific name is, I haven't got a flipping clue. But they are a nuisance, and because they stay small, they are inconspicuous. They can get in your media in pots, get behind your plants on your mounts, and live there quite happily chewing your roots. Right. Remember to put the tie on first. That's if my fingers will work. See, I know when I'm tired, because everything becomes a little more difficult. Nonetheless, I wanted to get these two done. I can't deal with these plants en masse. I would get too bored. But what I can do is, when I get a short day, you know, when I sort of finish my watering at lunchtime or something, I can do a couple in the afternoon. And if I'm really in the mood, I might end up doing half a dozen. But today it's just these two, because I have interest in them. You know me and my Dendrobiums, I do like them. And as I said, one of these fell out the pot, so it wasn't it wasn't well secured. Nonetheless, it still had some roots, and this one's got quite a good root system. I don't see any reason why this one shouldn't take off, quite honestly. And I want to get that around the middle of the mount, dangle some of the roots downwards. They'll get strapped in. I don't mind if some of them are aerial, that's not a big deal. But with the case with this plant, I want to tie it before I start messing with the moss, or it's just going to fall off, and then the moss will fall off, and with me being tired there could be some language, and we don't want that on video, do we? So if I just put a turn round now, in fact I'll put two. That's actually produced a few kikis part way up the plant. Those roots will head hopefully into the moss and down onto the bark. But I'm going to put two loops around this to make sure it stays put. There we go. Now I bet I haven't got a long enough piece of stuff to go around the moss as well. It's not going to get a huge amount of moss on it, but you have to bear in mind this is not a resting type Dendrobium. This is one that's a form of continuous grower. Where it comes from, unfortunately in my world, in the UK, it will slow down in the winter whether I like it or not, because I can't provide that level of heat and day length to keep it growing very actively through the winter. But nonetheless, being a continuous grower, it needs to stay hydrated. So this one's getting quite a bit of moss on it. And then just hope we've got enough fishing line to actually get that to sit still. Well, it's quite a narrow piece of wood. It should do. We should be okay. Panic not. One round there. One round quite close to the plant. And then have I got enough? No, this piece is going to be too short. Do you know, I haven't done that for a very, very long time. So what I'm going to have to do is tie that piece off and start a new piece, because the moss below the plant isn't secure. It'll just fall off. That hasn't happened for many a year. Never mind. It's not the end of the world, is it? Having to put another piece on. But it are a nuisance. Having to start again and do another loop and everything that goes with it. Never mind. It's not the end of the world. I'll leave those ends quite long because it still needs a tag. And then we'll get another piece. God, I haven't had to do that for ages. Now I'll end up with about 3 foot spare because I'll have far too much. Never mind. This reel of fishing line was actually given to me by my youngest son when he decided to move up north to go to university. I told him to have a flipping good clear up before he left and sort out all his stuff, because he's a bit of a squirrel, doesn't like to throw things out. And once upon a time he used to go fishing, and that spool of fishing line was just surplus to requirement, so I said I'll have that, I can use that. So that were good. Right. Starting again, annoyingly, nonetheless, it's not the end of the world. The hook was just about to pull my glass of wine over. You'd have heard that language a long way off. Spilling wine is a sacrilege, that is just not allowed. Alright, that should hold it all nicely. It's all falling flat on its face. You don't need 2 lots of long dangly ends to tie one tag on. Okay, there we go, plant nice and secure, yeah, roots down against the bark and a reasonable amount of moss to keep it reasonably hydrated. So naturally, see now that plant could be grown upright, but because it grows thin canes that get fatter towards the top, they're naturally going to keel over. So you end up with a wide plant, you know, you end up with canes that come out of your pot and head off in all directions, and it takes up like a circular foot on your shelf. If it's vertical, firstly it doesn't take any room up on my shelf, and hanging vertically is partly the way a lot of these grow. Yeah. So anyway, as I say, quite a few of these newer growths, not sure whether they've finished growing or not, some have, some haven't. If the growing tips of those canes that are still growing haven't got cold damage on them, they should now continue to grow, and obviously I'll be looking for new growths around the base soon. So there we go, that's that one done. Couple of mounts, Mr. Long One, I can't get that in shot, and that nice sort of bushy one. The blooms on that, if it follows its traits, the Goldschmidtianum has clusters of blooms that are quite tight together, and they're a gorgeous colour, but they're quite tight, star-like. But then the Victoria Reginiae could impart some of its colour into there, because you've got a deep cerise pink and a bluey purple colour with cream. The combination of that colour could be quite special. But with colour, when you've got a primary cross, sometimes one of the species is dominant and it keeps all of its colour and hardly any from the other parent. So that's a wait and see. And let's go and hang them up and wait and see. See you next time. Thanks for dropping by.